Our usable cash reserves are around $150 million as at end of March.
Right.
So that's excluding about $29 million in gold and about 130 million.
We have 29 million in gold?
That's it.
That's it. See, some of the questions we keep getting a lot on radio. People keep asking us, could you get an economist and ask them when things are going to get better?
So it's not enough just to have a finance minister on paper.
Right.
You also need to have a cabinet that will back him also. So typically IMF. In IMF agreements, you do need to have a cabinet that approves a number of steps along the way.
And we're under this belief that when you go to the IMF, like in a week, you're going to have checks rolling through. It's not the case. But realistically, how long will it take for us to complete the process of how did we end up here? Like, was it? And then the taxes, by the way. Speaking of which, we had a huge change in policy.
Yeah, recent. This is pure conjecture.
Right.
The most recent increase in the central bank's treasury bill holdings might have been to create some cash to pay April salaries for the public
and
sector.
then just that. So we don't even have enough time now to restructure some of those payments anyway.
Yeah, so really it's just a question of moving as fast as you can to get a standstill.
Hey guys, hello and welcome. My name is Lloyd from Light 87. I'm here with Deshal de Mel, Economist. Thank you for taking the time and being with us, Deshal.
My pleasure, Lloyd. My pleasure.
You must be really busy now, especially given everything that's going on. Can you tell us what your days have been like over the past few weeks?
Yeah, no, it's quite intense because there's so much happening on the economy. So there's a lot of implications for whether it's at company level, at policy level. So a lot of things to figure out. A lot of moving parts on going beyond the economy into the political sphere in the last few days as well. So yeah, certainly a lot of homework to be trying to figure out what's going on and then to figure out how to position ourselves going forward.
So we'll start off with the most pressing issue here, Deshal, and that is the fact that we still don't have a finance minister, and we're avoiding it like the plague, at least the people that have been offered the position. Why is it the hottest seat in the House right now? We know there's a range of problems, but from your understanding of the situation.
Yeah, so when we talk about solutions, really a lot of things that need to be done start off with initially engaging in negotiations with the IMF, beginning debt restructuring negotiations with our creditors, and for all of those, our counterparts will necessarily want to have some kind of longevity in the political backing for those negotiations, right? So, and that political backing would be really personified by a finance minister. So to give you an example, when you have a letter of engagement signed with the IMF, to be signed both by the central bank governor and the Minister of Finance. So without a Minister of Finance, the best you can do is start off the technical negotiations. But really, none of our counterparts are going to be willing to sign off on something without knowing that, okay, this has got serious political level backing that has longevity as well. Right, so it's not enough just to have a finance minister on paper.
Right.
You also need to have a cabinet that will back him also. So typically,
right.
in IMF agreements, you do need to have a cabinet that approves a number of steps along the way. So we are quite a long way from establishing that kind of stability at a political level, and that needs to be both. It has to have legitimacy both from a constitutional perspective, but also public legitimacy. If there is no public legitimacy of what is put forward, again, your counterparts, whether they are the IMF or your creditors, would doubt whether whatever is agreed upon will last beyond, say, a 6-month or a 12-month cycle.
Right.
So really, that longevity and legitimacy is crucial.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, we've seen this before, where a new set of ministers can come in and they'll be like, oh, listen, by the way, we didn't agree to that.
Yeah.
That was the guys that were gone. So that being said, now next week we're going to start our discussions with the IMF. Now, like you said, it's not just one guy, not just the finance minister here.
Yeah.
We're talking about a whole cabinet that's got to be involved on some level, or at least to show them that we are serious about this. Like, how do we go about this without? We've barely got a cabinet, and on top of that, we don't have a finance minister.
Yeah.
Is that going to hamper the process?
It certainly does hamper the process. So really, even before this political turmoil, it was not going to be an easy process going forward. Right? There was a lot of complexity in the negotiations that had to go forward. So this really adds an additional significant layer of complexity. So really, at this stage, the best that we can do is to start off on the technical side of negotiations. Right? So that can certainly be led by the officials from the central bank at the official level from the Treasury. So it's important now that we've had some crucial appointments in those roles. So they can start off in terms of getting the ball rolling with regard to the fundamental issues on, what are the tax adjustments that are going to be required, how do we go about our exchange rate policy, what do we do with interest rates, and they can come into some kind of in principle agreements on those things. But really, as I said, you're not going to get formal approval of those until you get the political legitimacy to back that up as well.
Right. And we're under this belief that when you go to the IMF, like in a week you're going to have checks rolling through. It's not the case. But realistically, how long will it take for us to complete the process of agreeing to their terms, making the necessary changes that maybe are good for us as well in the long? I know there's been a lot of demonizing of the IMF, but how long, in your experience, do you think it'll take for us to finally seal the deal and see that money come through?
Yeah. So there are probably two parallel roads that we need to talk about here.
Yeah.
So the first is, of course, the discussions with the IMF themselves. Now, the IMF has, under their lending rules, they are not supposed to lend to countries, that they can't provide financial assistance to countries whose debt IMF considers to be unsustainable. Now, in the recent IMF Article 4 consultation report, they confirmed that Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable. So the first thing that we need to do is start a restructuring of that of our external debt. The IMF does have a kind of window that says that if a country has made credible steps towards that restructuring process, then you can begin some kind of financing. So along with the IMF negotiations, in parallel to that, we also have the restructuring negotiations. So let's talk about the restructuring first. Now, restructuring of debt entails negotiations with a number of creditors. So they can be your bondholders, your multilateral lenders like the World Bank and the ADB, your bilateral lenders like China and Japan. And so given this kind of complex universe of lenders, that's also a pretty complicated and technical process. So you have to appoint professional restructuring advisors. So you have legal advisors and financial advisors. So that's really the first step in kind of getting this restructuring underway. Now, given this complexity that we talked about, the restructuring of debt will probably take between 12 and 24 months, okay, for that process to be completed. Now in parallel...
Sorry, and this is before we can even get funds from the IMF.
So the IMF will open up, will have a window for financing if you make credible steps on this restructuring process. Right?
Okay.
So that IMF process, which runs in parallel to this, would probably take a minimum of 6 months to come to what you call a staff level agreement. And it's once the staff level agreement comes in that you're able to start getting some financing from the IMF, but more importantly, it also unlocks the opportunity to raise financing from your other counterparts as well. So when you have a staff level agreement with the IMF, the World Bank will be willing to lend you some cash, ADB, Japan, China, all those guys will be much more willing to provide you with some kind of assistance. Now that's going to be crucial to be able to provide some kind of support on our foreign exchange that will enable us to start that recovery process.
Right. Now, I have a few questions in this regard, Deshal. Now, just talking about how we found ourselves in this position, right? So I know we've had a whole bunch of things from, the pandemic that affected us a little bit, but some studies show that we've done worse off than the other countries in the region. Then again, with our import restrictions, our bad management of finances, how did we end up here? Like, was it, and then the taxes, by the way, speaking of which, we had a huge change in policy, which will also change, I think, with the IMF coming in. What was the biggest contributor to us ending up here?
So the starting point was, as you quite rightly said, the tax cuts at the end of December 2019. Now, with that, what happened was Sri Lanka's credit ratings were downgraded several times. So we lost access to global capital markets. Now, we know that Sri Lanka does have obligations of paying back maturing debt each year. Typically, what a country in Sri Lanka's income status would do is to refinance most of that maturing debt. So then you don't put too much pressure on your reserves. Now, with our credit rating, with the credit rating downgrade and the fact that we lost access to global capital markets, we then had to service all those maturing debt out of our reserves. So our reserves, which were around $7.6 billion in 2019, have now come down quite drastically, largely because we've been using reserves to settle our debt repayments. So now with that real crunch in forex, we don't have the resources to be able to pay for critical imports like fuel, cooking gas, and so on. And that's really what has kind of led to this social unrest that we're seeing today as well.
Yeah. So aside from the lack of tourism revenue, the taxes were one of the biggest contributors here.
Absolutely.
One of the other questions, Deshal, is now with CBSL governor, the former CBSL governor Ajit Cabral. Some of the big criticisms for him were the fact that he was a bit too politically influenced, and the fact that he kind of really denied some of the ongoing problems at the time. Like, everything's fine, the neon lights are on, So with the returning former deputy governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, who's being brought back in, is he the man for the job? And what do you hope he addresses straight away? What are the key problems that he needs to address in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Veerasinghe being brought back in is certainly a very positive step. He's a career central banker. He has worked very closely with the IMF, so he led the technical negotiations on behalf of the central bank with the IMF in the last program, the 2016 to 2019 program. He also served previously as a deputy governor representing Sri Lanka at the IMF in DC also. So he's very familiar with the process. He's familiar with the markets. He's accepted by the markets, and he's also a very strong advocate of central bank independence. So I would think he's an extremely well-suited person in terms of leading Sri Lanka's negotiations with the IMF, leading Sri Lanka's negotiations on a restructuring process also. So I think he's a very good choice in that sense. In terms of his priorities, I would think the first thing that he has to do is to really re-anchor price stability in the economy, right? That's a primary role of the central bank. So you've seen inflation going almost out of control in the last few months. So anchoring inflation expectations is a critical role of the central bank. So I would expect that his first Monetary Board meeting would be on the 8th of April, that's today. And I would expect in that measures would be taken to really re-establish those inflation expectations. So interest rates are likely to increase to some extent as a result of that. And then also there are measures that would be taken to try to bring the currency under control also. Yeah. And of course the interest rate is part of that. But again, there are a number of other measures that would be required there. So I would think that would be his initial priority. And then of course in parallel to get the ball rolling on the debt restructuring process and on the IMF negotiations.
We understand the forex shortage.
Yeah.
Why are we still printing so much money? I think we printed like a few $100 billion over the last few weeks.
So there are a few misconceptions also in terms of what exactly we mean by money printing. So technically, the central bank has significantly reduced their what we call deficit financing, where the central bank buys directly government securities from the treasury. They've reduced that very significantly from around August 2021. But we still see in the data published, central bank's holdings of government securities increasing from time to time. Now, often what happens in those situations is that when the central bank settles some foreign debt on behalf of the government, so it effectively sells a foreign asset and it buys a domestic asset to compensate for that.
Right.
So you have on one side of the foreign part of the balance sheet reducing and the domestic part increasing. So in effect, it cancels each other out. So that's not really enhancing the overall money supply in the economy. Right. So in those situations, it doesn't have that same impact on inflation as it would purely by increasing your domestic assets without a decline in the foreign assets. So I would think that in the last 6 or 7 months, most of the increase in the central bank's domestic assets are actually in order to settle or by selling down some of the foreign assets. So it balances out. So the net increase has been not that significant. Small caveat on I think the most recent, this is pure conjecture.
Right.
The most recent increase in the central bank's treasury bill holdings might have been to create some cash to pay April salaries for the public sector.
And then just
that has happened in many years in the past.
Right.
But that's conjecture. I'm not going to put my money on that.
Yeah. So clearly not balancing anything else. But thank you for the time, Deshal. Before we let you go, one final question. We just heard that this month we're still due to pay a few dozen million. And plus next month we've got a few $100 million that we've got to pay back in sovereign bonds, and then in July we've got a $1 billion payment to be made. If we can't refinance those, can we, given our bad rating, can we restructure those? If we aren't able to pay those, which I know is something we'll avoid, what happens? Can we be taken to international arbitration? Are we able to pay those back?
Yeah. So if you look at Sri Lanka's usable reserves right now, the data came out on the 7th of April in the night, so last night. Our usable cash reserves are around $150 million as at end of March.
Right.
So that's excluding this $1.5 billion yuan swap that you can't use to pay dollar liabilities. It's excluding about $29 million in gold and about $130 million.
We have 29 million in gold?
That's it.
That's it. Okay.
And about 130 or so million in reserves with the IMF, again, that can't be used for debt settlements. So if you take all of those out, you're down to about $154 million in cash, right? Which is clearly not enough to meet the obligations that you quite rightly pointed out. So well before the sovereign bond matures in July, you hit a wall even prior to that. So that is why it's really crucial that Sri Lanka really expedites our process of restructuring these external debts. The first step, as we spoke about earlier, is to hire restructuring advisors who would then request a standstill on these outflows. That will actually free up some dollars that we can keep back in the country that we can use to really provide for the critical import requirements of our citizens.
Yeah.
Now, it is important to have that standstill agreement prior to these payments coming due. Right, so if we have that consent, then it becomes much more difficult for, as you quite rightly said, for the creditors to file legal action against us. Now, if in a situation we are not able to get solicit consent prior to missing a payment, then they can file legal action against the sovereign, and that makes it a lot more difficult to go through the rest of the negotiation process, right? So if you look at the data, in cases of preemptive default, the average time taken to complete a restructuring is about 8 months. I'm looking at data from about 2010 to 2020 in restructurings that have happened during that time. If you try to restructure after a default without having pre-agreed with your creditors, the average time goes to 22 months. So there's a material difference between the two, and that the complexity really is added because of these legal proceedings. Then that can materialize, and then there is also a significant negotiating power that shifts from the debtor to the creditor in the event that we go in for a formal default. Now, those are the changes that take place. On the ground, in terms of what's going to happen for you and I as citizens of this country, I think already we are seeing the manifestations of what a country in default would be going through, right? We have significant shortages in foreign exchange, inability to access critical commodities. So those are already pretty much there. It will probably get a little bit worse. But I don't think that the going in for a default, say an unnegotiated default, would change the ground situation in a huge way. It will change it because already we are seeing the worst of it, pretty much the worst of it. So I would think those are the kind of implications of not being able to meet one of these payments that is falling due in the next few months. But the important message is that I think a lot of us focus on these big ticket payments such as the July bond. There's a lot of stuff on the way that can be a stumbling block very easily.
Little payments here and there. And that being said, Deshal, so we don't even have enough time now to restructure some of those payments anyway. Yeah,
so really it's just a question of moving as fast as you can to get a standstill. Because that restructuring process, as we discussed, is going to be a 12 to 24 month game.
Unless Big Daddy India comes through with a 3 billion or something, I don't know. It's not looking good.
It's not looking good.
But gosh, but listen, Deshal, thank you so much, and we'll be touching base with you whenever we can. We appreciate you coming on and breaking it down for us.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Deshal de Mel. Be sure to check out the links below. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and share the video.